So I anticipate this being one of the quicker IXLs to run through. We're talking about something called the discriminant. So we just talked through some stuff about solving quadratics, and we introduced the quadratic equation in the last one. And the discriminant, this word that they're using right here, is actually just a certain piece of the quadratic formula. So it's kind of what I suggested to work on first. Let's go with tangerine color here. Oops, it didn't click. There we go. It's just this part of the quadratic formula. This discriminant, this label they give, whatever value we end up with here is going to determine how many x-intercepts the parabola, that U-shape, actually has. So let's work through one and see what we end up with here. So the first thing you need to do is think back to when we talked about introducing the quadratic formula and think about how we have an a value, a b value, and a c value. And those would all get plugged in here. And let's only do the stuff that's circled in the orange there. So if I do the square root, and technically the discriminant is just like the inside stuff, but we can talk about the change here. So the square root, I'm trying to move this to where it doesn't look like it's part of that, of b squared, that's a squared right here, so that would be 6 squared, or 36 in this instance, minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 5. If we actually calculate that, think about order of operations. Remember, this multiplication comes before subtraction. So 4 times 2 times 5. Well, 4 times 2 is 8, times 5 is 40. So inside the square root here, I would have 36 minus 40, which would give us negative 4. Now, this is where the square root part of it kind of comes in. A negative number, if we take the square root of that, we're not going to be able to get any value that we know how to work with right now. There's something called imaginary numbers, and we can get into complex numbers, but that's nothing that we've dealt with so far. So basically what that means is if you work out this inside portion here, even underneath the square root, like we said, the discriminant, if it is a negative number, tells me that this parabola doesn't have any x-intercepts, which actually means the U-shape doesn't cross the x-axis at all. So there's a gap between the x-axis and the vertex, or maybe if it opens down, it would be something like that. So if I fill in the negative 4 here, there we go. So that's what it shows me. Let's rewind a little bit now, find the discriminant again. So let's just talk about that underneath the square root part. Remember, that's b squared minus 4ac. Now we know that square root's there, and we can talk about what it means. Remember, if we don't see an a value or a b value, those are 1s. So b squared would be 1 squared. 1 times 1 is just 1. Minus, so that b is this, minus 4 times a is also 1. Times c is 5. Remember, this multiplication happens before subtraction. 4 times 1 is 4, times 5 is 20. So we'd have 1 minus 20 equals negative 19. So because this is negative, we'd have something similar to the last one where we actually wouldn't cross the x-axis at any point in the whole parabola, where that U shape would be lifted up above the x-axis, or if it was flipped upside down, it'd be pushed below the x-axis. And we'd put in our number here. Okay, find the discriminant again, so same thing. B squared minus 4ac, so b squared would be 2 squared. I'll actually write that out. Minus 4 times a. Remember, if I don't see anything, that's just a 1. Times c is 9. Remember this multiplication before the subtraction. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 1 is 4. Times 9 is 36. Looks like we're getting a bunch of negatives in a row here. So we would get negative 32. So far, kind of all the same concept. Okay, for this one. And the reason I'm going through so many examples is that first video we did while we were doing these like IXL lessons recorded, I don't think I did enough examples, and there were people getting confused about some differing problems, so that's why we're going through more. Alright, so b squared would be 7 squared, so 49. And you could type in 7 times 7 or 7 squared, that's where that comes from. Minus, so b squared minus 4 times a, well that's also 4 here, if I look right there. Times c is 2. Remember this multiplication first. 4 times 4 times 2 is 32. So that tells me, just from looking at this, I'm going to get a positive number this time. 49 minus 32 is 17. When this works out to be a positive number, that tells me I'm actually going to have 2 x-intercepts, so if I make my coordinate plane again. It doesn't mean necessarily I cross at 17, but if you remember, the whole formula has that plus and minus part to it. So we'd have like negative b, whatever that would be, so in this case it would be like negative 7. Let's actually fill that in. Negative 7 plus and minus 17. Well, the square root of 17, but we know that's a positive number. Divided by 2 times a, so that'd be 2 times 4, and you get 8. The reason I know we're getting 2 answers is because negative 7 plus some number, even if this works out to be some decimal, is going to be different from negative 7 minus that number. So those are going to give me 2 different options, meaning this parabola is going to cross at 2 different spots. And I'm not going to work through it. You guys could do that. That's not what we're asking for here. But basically it tells me that it crosses at 2 different locations. If this was a negative, this works out to be like an imaginary number. It would give us like an error on the calculator, and we couldn't do anything here. That's why there were 0 places. So that's how I would know. Or if it was flipped upside down, maybe something like this. It crosses twice. And those are kind of what, those 2 places are kind of what we were finding in the last IXLs. Okay, so let's put in, I think we had 17. Alright. How many real solutions does this have? So this is probably the last type of problem we'll look at. So we said no real solutions happens when you find that discriminant and you get a negative number. So let's put like negative x, let's say, or something like that. A negative number for the discriminant, that's no solutions. A positive number gives you 2. Well, what about that last one that we haven't talked about yet? That would actually be if the discriminant works out to be exactly 0. The reason being is if we have our quadratic formula and we do the plus or minus part, the square root of 0 was as 0. Whatever this number is, plus 0, is going to be the same thing as whatever this number is, minus 0. So although you might technically get 2 answers, it's just going to be the same number twice, meaning you just have one real solution. What that would look like is on the coordinate plane, your parabola only touches the x-axis at the vertex. So maybe something like that, or if it was flipped upside down, maybe something like that. So it just touches once. Okay, so I would need to work through this one. So I would say b squared is 8 squared 64 minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 8. Remember, this multiplication all happens first. 4 times 2 is 8 times 8 again is 64. So I'd have 64 minus 64, and that would give me 0. So that would actually be what we just talked about right there. Crazy how that works out. Alright, so let's skip ahead and see if there's anything else that we didn't touch on. Okay, let's touch on this while I see it. Notice how there's only 2 terms here. This would be your a, and I know that because this s squared is here. This would not be b, it would be c, because it doesn't have any variable on it. You're actually missing the s term that would be in the middle. That tells me that your b value is 0. It'd be like if I had a 0s in there. So if they don't show a term at all, that means it's 0. So that's the difference between 0 and 1. 1, they'll show you the variable, just not the number in front. A 0, there won't be anything there. It'll be completely missing. So you just use 0 as your b value. We'll keep going. And then we're past 70. That's what I'm going to ask you to go to. And it looks like we're ending up with the same thing here. Anything else? At 90s. Okay. So in this one, that you would just need to add 4 over, add 4z over, and then you could proceed as normal. But that's all extra for what we're doing. Alright, we'll wrap up there. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and we'll kind of try to progress slowly through this stuff. Have a good one.